Hey Optimancers, Chris here. Okay, so why am I talking about invisibility now? I mean, there's tons of videos and articles and everything that talked about invisibility for years and years. Well, I've been thinking a lot about the infamous darkness plus devil sight combination. There's some obvious reasons you would want to do this: advantage on attacks, disadvantage to be attacked. But on the other hand, it can be disruptive to the party, and worst of all, it's not only unreliable, the reliability drops as levels go up. But invisibility, it's a bit harder to put on your build, and you might be thinking it has reliability problems too. After all, just look at all the monsters at higher challenge ratings with True Sight. Except, really, at least as written, invisibility is super reliable. If we can make invisibility work on a build, the advantage on that is substantial. Now I could do a video where I just talk about how invisibility works, except, like I said, there's already videos on that, there's already articles on that, I'm not providing anything new with that. And I could probably do a video just on how invisibility works at different tables in D&D. Some of the rules are weird, others are misunderstood. A lot of DMs apparently really love playing Battleship because they turn invisibility into that game. However, this here is one of my build lead-in videos. So instead, what I'm going to focus on here is the rules, every friggin' way we can get our character invisible, which of these are good for optimization, and how we might fit them on a build. I'm going to touch on some various ways I've seen invisibility handled, but I'm just not going to spend a lot of time on that. So here's a fun anecdote. I have interacted and played with multiple active D&D players who have no idea that invisibility is a condition. They knew invisibility was a thing, they understood it as a concept, and they knew if you couldn't see your opponent, you would have disadvantage on attacks against that target, but had no idea it was in the list of conditions in Appendix A of the Player's Handbook. I mean, here is an actual conversation I had with the DM. Might not be word for word, but this is basically how it went. Okay, I'll attack, I have advantage. Why do you have advantage? Because I'm invisible. Invisibility doesn't give advantage, it gives disadvantage to attacks against you. But the condition says I get advantage on attacks. What condition? Invisible? Invisibility is a condition? So let's start with that. Yes, invisibility is a condition, and it tells you everything you need to know about being invisible. Wait, no, that's not accurate. Let me rephrase that. It tells you a bit of what you need to know about being invisible. So here it is. Invisible. An invisible creature is impossible to see without the aid of magic or a special sense. For the purposes of hiding, the creature is heavily obscured. The creature's location can be detected by any noise it makes or any tracks it leaves. Attack rolls against the creature have disadvantage, and the creature's attack rolls have advantage. So it's just 2 bullet points, but that's really 5 pieces of information. First, it tells us we can't be seen. I know, duh. But this isn't just conceptual. A ton of spells and features use the phrase, a creature you can see, or similar wording. So for example, here's the fighter's interception fighting style. When a creature you can see hits a target other than you, so if the attacker is invisible, then you don't get to use interception. There are a ton of features like that use this language. It's even more prevalent in spells. Here's the very first spell listed in the Player's Handbook, Acid Splash. Choose 1 or 2 creatures you can see within range. This is just super common wording in the game. What's important is the feature or spell tells us if it's going to work on someone we can see or not. Look for those words. A creature you can see. If it's there, invisibility is going to prevent it. If not, then it won't. Though be aware that there are some things where it says like a target that can see or hear you. So enchantment wizards, you're still fine using hypnotic gaze if you're invisible. So yeah, it's obvious, but it's worth mentioning that if you're invisible, you can't be seen. Though some things you might think it would affect don't have that a creature you can see language. For example, here's the bless spell. It just says you bless 3 creatures in range. So there's no a creature you can see language. And that means as long as you know the invisible creature is within range, then I guess you can bless them, even if you can't see them. The second piece of information is, for the purposes of hiding, the creature is heavily obscured. Now here's where I would normally show you the rule that says, if you're heavily obscured, you can hide. Actually, the hide rules are a mess, and it actually doesn't straight out say that. But it is something we can probably piece together by looking at several different spots in our player's handbook, a process that I made the viewers of my Pass Without Trace video suffer through, and I'm not going to do it again. I'll just link the video up above if you want a deep dive in the mess that are the rules on hiding. But the most important thing here isn't that you have the obscurement to hide. The important thing here is that if invisibility means you can hide, then that also means that being invisible doesn't mean you're hidden already. This is so important to understanding how the rules work for invisibility, and something I wish more DMs knew about. When you're invisible, you can take the hide action, but you still need to take the hide action if you want to be hidden. Yet, so many DMs I've encountered treat invisibility like the creature is hidden, even with no hide action or worrying about what my passive perception is. So now we're in a game of friggin' Battleship. Guess which square to target. Maybe the invisible creature is there. This is not how invisibility works. This is reinforced by our third piece of information. Your location can be determined by any noise you make or any tracks you leave. Jeremy Crawford did an interview where he talked about this more, but basically, if you're invisible, that doesn't mean other creatures don't know where you are, even if they can't see you. As we just discovered, you aren't hidden. So the noise you make and the tracks you leave, the squeak of the floorboards you stepped on, the twang of your bow, you're obscured from sight, but your position is not obscured, unless you use stealth to take the hide action. If you do that, then you get a stealth roll. And if you succeed, then your position really is obscured until you give it away. The fourth piece of information is attacks against the invisible creature have disadvantage, and the fifth is that its attacks have advantage. Now there's two amazing things about this. First, these two final points are obviously a fantastic combination. Amazing defense piled on amazing offense wrapped up in one condition. The second amazing thing is this is a separate bullet point on the invisible condition from being unseen. Now bear with me because I'm not speculating here. Please hold off correcting me in the comments. This means that if we're invisible, we still have the advantage and disadvantage even if we're seen. Now there's two things to unpack here. First is, how can an invisible creature be seen? Well, there's the See Invisibility spell, there's True Sight, there's Blind Sight. All of these things let you see an invisible creature, and it would just make sense. If you could see an invisible creature, then the invisibility condition wouldn't apply to you. And I 100% support all you DMs out there who say it just makes sense that if you can see an invisible creature, it shouldn't get these benefits against you. And that's why I covered it in a weird rules video, because it is weird. But at least according to Jeremy Crawford, this is how it works.
The invisible condition has the isolated bullet point. Attack rolls against the creature have disadvantage, and the creature's attack rolls have advantage. This means that See Invisibility and other non-sight senses don't stop the advantage on attacks from being invisible. Is this intended, assumed to be ignored, or a target for future errata?
So, before I answer the question, I will also point out there are abilities in the game that explicitly say the target of them, like the Fairy Fire spell does this, gains no advantage from the invisibility condition, meaning the whole thing is shut off for them, which would include this second bullet. But if you're in a situation where that bullet is not explicitly shut off, and the questioner is astute in noticing that bullet does not explicitly rely on others being incapable of seeing the invisible person, because we know in D&D, this multiverse of magic, there are cases where you might actually be able to discern an invisible person through some means. If the means that you're using does not explicitly shut off the advantages of the invisible condition, you can be in the odd situation of you can see them, yet that second bullet still applies. And by the way, this is intentional. That's why we have things in the game that explicitly shut the whole condition off, but other places we don't.
Now, I would advise every player that if I was going to play a character that used the invisible condition, I would definitely check with my DM whether they're going to run the rules on the invisible condition as written, and I guess as intended, or whether they would like to impose common sense through house rules. And here's where I need to pause. If I spoke to a DM and they told me the rules on this don't make sense, and of course a creature that has true sight or blind sight won't treat my character as having the invisible condition, then we're done here. There are easier ways to not be seen by the enemy than getting the invisible condition. The invisible condition is actually harder to get than just not being seen. And if we're going to make that investment, then it needs to give us an advantage. But if the invisible condition is played as written, it is a big advantage for us to use that over other methods of not being seen. Here's a list of all the monsters in D&D. That's 128 pages, 20 monsters per page. Here's a list of all the monsters with true sight or blind sight. 29 pages. That's like a quarter of them. And what this doesn't take into account is it's more prevalent among the higher challenge rating monsters. So as levels go up, you're more and more likely to face true sight or blind sight, and that's going to wreck your Gloomstalker not being seen. It's going to wreck your Warlock with Darkness and Devil's Sight from not being seen. But Invisible, although they are seen, should still get advantage on attacks and disadvantage to be attacked. So if we can use that condition that way, then it's reasonable to look at any way we might be able to use it. It's all about having that sweet, sweet invisible condition. We get advantage, they get disadvantage, and they can true sight all they want. Here's a true sight, me kicking your ass. Okay, so we're going to talk about Battleship again. Here's how it works. If you're not invisible, you need obscurement or cover in order to hide. The rules, unfortunately, are not explicit on how much obscurement or cover you need, just that the DM will let you know. But you know what? If you are the DM, the rules will not let you know, so you have to come up with something. However, if you're invisible, it shouldn't matter. As long as you aren't facing something with true sight or blind sight or see invisible, then you can hide, even in an empty room. You make a stealth roll, and if your roll beats the passive perception of a creature, then it has no idea where you are. So now it is more than just disadvantage. They also have to guess which area they want to make their attacks. So now we are playing Battleship. So to sum up, if you attack an invisible creature, you have disadvantage. If you attack a hidden creature, if you guess their position wrong, you're attacking thin air. Now, one solution to this is Fireball, or any area of effect spell. These spells usually don't require you to see the target, and you only need to know like the rough area of where they are. Now, let's talk about being invisible. Some effects that make you invisible end if you attack or cast a spell. The invisibility spell, for example, has that restriction, but some forms of invisibility don't have this restriction. If we want a build that uses invisibility in combat, we can't really have this restriction. Otherwise, the first time we attack or we cast a spell, then we're going to lose it. And then we would need to become invisible again, eating into our action economy. The other challenge that we have is the duration. Most invisibility effects that don't have the no attacking or casting spells restriction also have a short duration. Some have both. So then you end up using your action on round 1 just to set it up. Round 1 is an important round. We do not want to use it completely for setup. So let's look at how to become invisible. These are things that give you the condition, folks, not sitting in a fog cloud or anything like that. Every way to become invisible in the game. The invisibility spell, obviously, uses an action to cast and uses concentration, and then, although it technically can last up to an hour, it's not going to last an hour because we are attacking, baby. The greater invisibility spell, obviously, uses an action to cast, and it uses concentration, and it only lasts a minute. However, for one combat, this will keep that sweet invisible condition on you. Almost for sure. We'll get back to that. Let's keep on spells. Mislead. This is a 5th level spell, and it's basically the invisibility spell, except you get an illusionary duplicate of yourself that you can move around and you can see and hear through it. But the limits on attacks and casting spells are still there. For this kind of build, this isn't the spell we're looking for. Then, Sequester. A 7th level spell turns a willing creature invisible. Unfortunately, the invisible creature falls into a state of suspended animation. It's a cool spell for DM to introduce some ancient ally or enemy, but definitely not what we're looking for on an invisibility build. Cloak of Shadows. This is a trickery cleric feature that allows you to use your channel divinity to become invisible until the end of your next turn, and it uses your action. So it's super limited in use, uses our action, lasts a round. We need to do a lot better than this. Nature's Veil. This is a ranger optional class feature. At level 10, you can use a bonus action to become invisible until the start of your next turn. This one is pretty sweet, but it's also pretty limited in uses. Proficiency bonus times per long rest, and you have to have 10 levels in ranger to get it. And since it only lasts a round, we're basically talking proficiency bonus rounds per long rest. Hidden Step. Be a Furbolg, and you can turn invisible at level 1 as a bonus action. However, you get some limitations. Lasts until the start of your next turn. It ends if you make an attack. It ends if you make a damage roll. It ends if you force someone to make a saving throw. It's usable a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus per long rest. So this is pretty limited, but if you were, say, a 10th level Furbolg Ranger, you would have 8 invisibility bonus actions. One with Shadows. Warlock Invocation requires you to be a 5th level Warlock. You can use your action to become invisible in dim light or darkness as an action, as often as you want. The big problem, though, it ends if we move, or take an action, or reaction. That's the most restrictive one we've come across so far. Next up is Shroud of Shadow. This is a 15th level Warlock feature. Did you know Warlocks had 2 different invocations that turn them invisible? So this one allows you to cast invisibility at will, and you don't expend a spell slot. And now I kind of wondered whether I'd bother including this because I've already covered invisibility. We already know the limitations of invisibility probably aren't going to work for a build that is going to rely on invisibility to get advantage in combat. But I thought this was worth mentioning because it's at will. And I'm going to ignore most of the things that allow you to cast invisibility. There are quite a few of them. But I'm going to mention a couple, and this is one of them. And let's stick with Warlocks. Misty Escape allows a 6th level Archfey Patron Warlock to turn invisible as a reaction when they take damage on top of a nifty teleport, but it only lasts until the start of your next turn or until you cast a spell. Not sure why that second part is there. I mean, it's going to be pretty difficult to take damage, then use your reaction, then somehow cast a spell before your next turn. I mean, I guess if you took damage on your turn before taking your action, then I guess you could cast a spell. I mean, I don't know. It just seems like an unnecessary restriction for a case that's probably very rare. Fade Away. This is a gnome racial feat. You can turn invisible after you take damage as a reaction. Lasts until the end of your next turn, until you attack, deal damage, or force someone to make a saving throw. This actually seems worse than the Furbolg's Hidden Step, and you have to take a feat. And it's usable only once per rest. Cloak of Shadows. This is an 11th level monk feature from the Way of Shadow subclass. There is no usage limit on this one, but it uses your action, it requires you to be in dim light or darkness, and it lasts until you make an attack, cast a spell, or are in an area of bright light. Probably not what we're looking for. But the cool thing here is, other than the things that break this, there's technically no duration. Now, if you're not a Way of Shadows monk, you can still get invisibility. It's only going to require 18 levels in monk. Then you would get Empty Body. This allows you to use your action. You spend 4 key points and you become invisible for a minute. One thing here is nothing breaks this, so you're not concentrating. You don't have to worry about making attacks or casting spells or anything else you're doing. It won't break this invisibility. And during that time, you also have resistance to just about every kind of damage, not force damage. So this is a pretty good form of invisibility. The issue is, of course, the requirement of 18 levels. and it is going to use your action to set up. And because it's not a spell, there's no way to quicken it. So there's no way we can take this action and turn it into a bonus action. I mean, maybe you could take 2 levels of fighter and do an action surge, but then we're talking about a 20th level character before we get this going. Now, I have talked a little bit about races, so I should probably mention this, or you might wonder why I didn't. The Duergar, of course, can cast invisibility. Also, the Glacia Tiefling can cast invisibility, though the Glacia Tiefling is from Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, which is a discontinued product, so you would need to check with your DM if it's even allowed at your table. But in either case, we're just talking about casting the invisibility spell. I've already covered the invisibility spell, so there's nothing new to discover with either of these options. We're getting into items. The Potion of Invisibility. Use your action to chug the potion and you're invisible for an hour, or until you attack or cast a spell. Obviously, like in the invisibility spell, this is not what we're looking for. Dust of Disappearance. This one is mass invisibility, but it has the action to use plus the cast a spell or make an attack and it ends restriction. Lasts 2d4 minutes. The Ring of Invisibility. There's a lot to like here. Bonus action invisibility as often as you like. Now, attacks and spells still break the invisibility, but let's be real, the big problem is this is a legendary item. Now, there is a magic item that is better than the Ring of Invisibility at turning you invisible. However, I should at least lump together there are several magic items in the game that allow you to cast spells. And some of those spells that allow you to cast include invisibility, greater invisibility, even sequester or mislead, and they're just the spells. So I'm not going to bother going through all the options to get the spells that I've already covered. And here is the king, the Cloak of Invisibility. This one, it's awesome. No silly attack or cast a spell restrictions, and you can use it for 2 hours. But, small problem, it is a legendary item. So maybe bribe your DM with pizza? Now, if you want to tell me in the comments other ways that you can have the, say, invisibility spell cast, feel free. However, my goal here wasn't to tell you every way that you can cast invisibility or every way you can cast greater invisibility or every way you might have it cast, because you could always do something like summon something that could cast invisibility. But my goal here was just to look at the various ways to turn invisible. I've covered the spells, so however you get them, it's still the same spells. However, if I legitimately miss something that gives your character the invisible condition, definitely let me have it in the comments. This was everything I could find. So the goal of this big list was to find every way that we could get the invisible condition so that we could put it on a build, and then when we're in combat, we would have advantage on our attacks and disadvantage on attacks against us. And although there are many different ways that we can turn invisible as a PC, what I found was that the vast majority of those don't work for that kind of purpose, because most of them are broken if we were to make attacks. Now, some of them kind of work, like if we look at the Ranger's Nature's Veil, it's a bonus action to set up and we can make attacks with it. However, it's so limited in use and such a short duration that we can't really center a build around it because it's just too limited. It really looks to me like the only way that we can turn invisible, use it in combat effectively, is got to be the greater invisibility spell. So that's what we're going to have to work with. The problem with that, of course, is it has a 1 minute duration and it is a full action to cast. And we don't want to use a full action on the first round of combat in just setup. So that means we're going to need to be able to cast it as a bonus action, and that's going to require the Quicken Spell metamagic. This will allow us to cast greater invisibility as a bonus action, keeping our action available for attacking. 2 sorcery points per casting, we can work with that. So how do we get greater invisibility? Well, we can take 7 levels in Bard, Sorcerer, Wizard, Warlock, assuming the Archfey, Genie, or Undead patron, Druid with the Circle of the Land subclass, taking the Underdark terrain, friggin' Twilight Cleric because, of course, or a mere 13 levels in Artificer Armorer. And I should mention that although True Sight, Blind Sense, Tremor Sense, and See Invisibility don't end the invisible condition, that doesn't mean nothing does. If you're casting greater invisibility, Counterspell could prevent you from casting it in the first place, and Dispel Magic could end it, though as a 4th level spell, there would be an ability check for either of those things. Also, assuming we're using a spell, concentration can be broken, either by taking damage or anything else that breaks concentration. Now, Fairy Fire technically doesn't end the invisibility condition, but it does prevent you from benefiting from it. So it's kind of the same thing. Though, if you can drop the concentration of the person who casts Fairy Fire, that would make you invisible again. Furthermore, we do get a dexterity save to avoid the effect entirely. Branding Smite would ruin our day, but they would have to hit us with disadvantage to land it. And some monsters have other ways to end spells, but really not many of them. Once Greater Invisibility is up, then we have the invisible condition. And then our job is to not take a lot of damage, and then we're probably okay. Which brings us to our build. And for that, you need to wait until my next video. And until then, I am going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody. I'll talk to you soon.